Yes, my name is Joseph McGill, and I am the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Slave Dwelling Project is a very simple concept. I find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and I ask the owners if I could spend the night in these spaces. Because, once upon a time, one could come to a site like this and only encounter what you see here, all this nice beauty here, all this architectural significance here, the house on the hill, and you could very easily learn about the people who inhabited these spaces. But then the story would stop right there. They would tell you about these nice columns. They tell you about the nice, beautiful, grand staircase that you see when you walk through the front door. They tell you about the place settings and all of this. But very seldom would you hear about, who cut down those trees that's now that house. Or if the house is made of bricks, who made the bricks that's now that house? Who went into the quarries and took those stones out of the quarry and transported them here to make all of this? That would not have been included in the narrative 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago. In the year 2010, when I started the Slave Dwelling Project, I was also a Civil War reenactor. Of course, reenacting for the North. For those of you who saw the movie Glory, that was the movie that inspired me to become a Civil War reenactor. And being a Civil War reenactor, I would get the opportunity to go to various Civil War sites, and we would reenact battles at those sites. And reenacting those battles also gave us the opportunity to sleep at these sites. But before the sleepovers, we would go from campfire to campfire because every camp would have a campfire. We can, go to campfires and we could have these conversations and we could consult with each other. And I would talk to some of the Confederate reenactors and some of the Union reenactors and discover, some of us as reenactors, should not have been reenactors. Because I talked to some guys that you shouldn't be letting your kids hang out with. I talked to some reenactors, especially the Confederate kind, that wanted to change the outcome of the war. And they had those attitudes, and they were living it through this Civil War reenacting. So what that gave us the opportunity to do is to really interact with these places, kind of wear it, if you will, kind of put it on and test drive it and wear it, because you have access to these places, these historic sites, after hours when the people aren't there. And it is something to that. But more important was the opportunity to sit around these campfires and have these conversations. So 12 years ago, I was employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And that's an organization, prestigious organization, that saved places like this. But it's the places like this. It's not the place behind it. It's all this beauty that you see here before you. So now it comes to mind in interacting with these Civil War reenactors. Some of my Confederate Civil War reenactors would say such lines as, well, the Civil War was not necessary. The slavery was on its way out. So now if I were to have that same conversation with some of these Civil War reenactors, I would say, well, if you do what I do, go around and see these beautiful, nice houses like this, you would come to the conclusion that no one was going to give this up willingly. And they proved it. They went to war. I'm from South Carolina, guys. I'm from that state that when Abraham Lincoln was elected, the people in my state took their ball and went home. They said, this is it. I'm done with it. I'm through. Now, the population of my state of South Carolina in 1860 was approximately 703,000 people. And of that 703,000 people, approximately 402,000 of them were enslaved. There was one other state with a similar ratio, and that was the state of Mississippi. The first two states to secede from the Union was the state of Mississippi. So there's a point there somewhere. So with these opportunities that I had to go to these sites, go to these Civil War battlefields and work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and having the DNA that I possess and going to these historic sites like this and not hearing the stories about the people who I share DNA with that inhabited these spaces, it sparked the idea of asking the stewards of these places if I could spend the night. What also sparked that idea was the fact that I was a part of a team that was inspecting the work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, where I'm currently employed on a full-time basis. They were restoring the slave cabins there, and they made me a part of a team to inspect the work that was being done. And because I was inspecting the work that was being done, I said out loud, you know, if when they finish this, I would like to spend the night in these spaces. Somebody heard it. Somebody took it up the chain of command at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. They thought it was a great idea, and they passed it on up the chain. And the executive director at the time, Tom Johnson, thought it was a great idea. So then I said, well, I can at least stay at this place. And then I said to myself, well, if I can stay at this place, maybe I can stay at more places. So I shared the idea with the State Historic Preservation Office. Deborah, are you here? Yeah, I used to work there, State Historic Preservation Officer. In fact, guys, you need to thank Deborah, my friend, Rebecca, I'm sorry, Nebraska. Got that one right? Thank her because she worked then in South Carolina, and she moved here. She's now working here for a historical society.
I'm actually working for the Department of Transportation.
Thank you. I got it all wrong. But it's because of you that I'm here, so take credit for that. So, say yeah, give her a hand. So I got the list from the State Historic Preservation Office, and because they understood, they knew that what I was trying to do was in agreement with what they do. It's about preservation. It's about saving buildings. So they gave me a list that applied to what I was doing. It had all these slave dwellings with them on it that they knew of. So I got this list, and I started making phone calls, started going down the list, and I got enough yeses to say, yes, I'm going to do this. I put them on the list, and now, putting them on the list was not that easy. I had to make the phone call, and making a phone call and making a request to these stewards of these places that I want to come to your site, and I want to spend the night in your slave cabin. Now, if you're on the other end of that call, you would have to have second thoughts. You'd have to think, well, why is this guy wanting to do this? You know, as well as I could explain myself, there's still hesitation. Because first of all, it's not tested. First of all, some of these folks don't know who I am. Now, you're gonna have to wonder, is this guy seeking reparations? Is he looking for ghosts? Is he looking for treasures? Well, none of the above. It's about honoring the enslaved ancestors by acknowledging the places, the buildings, the built environment that still exists that can help tell the story of their existence. That's what the project was about then. That's what this project is about now. So, I got enough yeses to step out on faith and say, yes, I'm going to do this. So my very first stay was at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, where I'm now employed. And so 12 years later, Mother's Day of next month, I'm going to be sleeping in that same place on Mother's Day to commemorate the 12th year of the slave dwelling project. So now, there I was, waking up at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens on Mother's Day of 2010, not being familiar with the property at all. Took a walk, not knowing where I was going. I went to the cemetery where the enslaved people were buried. Now, how did I know enslaved people were buried there? Well, looking at the headstones, I saw that some people were born enslaved but died free, which means they had a headstone. Because if they were born enslaved and died enslaved, they had no headstone. And a lot of folks ask, well, why not? Why didn't they have a headstone? Well, having a headstone means that you have to write something on that. That means you're educated. And of course, we know that those enslavers were not going to buy a headstone, place a headstone on somebody's grave whose labor they had stolen all their lives. So, knowing that some of those folks were born enslaved, I started looking around a little more. And I saw indentions in the earth. Indentions in the earth. Well, what that was an indication of, if those enslaved people were lucky enough to have been buried in a box, a pine box, then eventually that pine box is going to give way and the earth above it is going to conform to all that. So that's what you do when you're looking for these graves and they're unmarked. If you have some type of indication that is a slave cemetery, look for those indentions in the earth. Now, in Texas, using the process that I'm about to explain probably won't work because it doesn't snow in Texas. After a light snow, a dusting maybe, you can see those indentions in the earth a lot better. So, when you're exploring for those things, check that out as much as possible. So I started out on this journey, and I was now going around to these places. Of course, now my original intent was to stay in the state of South Carolina. That's where my limited resources would take me, in the state of South Carolina. So I started it. I'm doing this thing. And a lot of people are worried about me. A lot of people are worried about me for various reasons. First of all, they think I'm crazy, because who would think of such a thing? To want to go sleep in a slave dwelling, not only sleep in a slave dwelling, but sleep in a slave dwelling all alone. So they thought that there would be people who would be out there to harm me. 12 years ago, the Confederate flag was still flying very high above our state's capital in South Carolina. So people feared that there were going to be people out there with those attitudes, wanted to push back against this thing by causing me some type of harm. There were folks out there that thought I would be haunted and be scared, and there were those out there that thought, well, just ignore him, he'll go away. But 12 years later, I'm still at this thing. So I'm so much into this thing that, I've created categories of places that I now go to and that I now stay. 12 years ago, when I started this project, I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South, because that's how I was educated. Not only did I have slavery relegated to plantations in the South, my education said the slaves were happy and the enslavers were benevolent. All false. All junk history that I was taught. History that I had to purge my mind of to find out otherwise, to find out the truth. So I go to colleges and universities because, there are a lot of colleges and universities out there that owe their existence to the institution of slavery. The University of South Carolina, which I've been trying to get into for quite some time, they have slave dwellings there on the campus. The Horseshoe, the famous Horseshoe. I've made the request to spend the night there to no avail. University of Alabama, same applies. Slave dwellings on the property. I've made a request to spend the night there to no avail. Francis Marion University in Florence, South Carolina, same result. No, we see what you're doing, but no, you can't spend the night in those slave dwellings. But if you flip that, I spent the night at the University of Virginia, Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. My very first sleepover at an institution of higher learning was at Sweetbriar College in Sweetbriar, Virginia. The amazing thing about Sweetbriar College is this. The gentleman who created Sweetbriar Plantation was a Vermonter from the state of Vermont. He left the state of Vermont an abolitionist. And then he got to Sweetbriar, Virginia, and started a plantation. Other places I've spent the night, Furman University, Clemson University. My daughter graduated from Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina. Now, when my daughter was seeking a place to attend her undergrad, we went on that junket, that college junket, and we went to Clemson University and we went on a tour. They gave her the tour. And I had to hold back, guys, because they were telling her all the good things. What they didn't tell her was that Clemson University is on a former plantation. Clemson University, those original buildings were built by convict labor. John C. Calhoun, who some of you may be familiar with, his mansion was moved to that campus. It's on that campus. And when I got the real story of what went on in that particular mansion, this noted historian at Clemson University said, you know, there was a situation in that particular mansion where the owners got old, it became infirm, but they had a method of summoning the enslaved people to come care for them. The enslaved person would be sleeping on a pallet right outside the door of that infirm person. Well, tied to the wrist of that enslaved person would be a string. At the other end of that string is where the enslaver, the infirm person, laid. If that person would wake up at night and need to be taken care of, she just pulls on that string, yank on that string to let that enslaved person know it's time to come in and do for me what I need you to do. So that's the story. That's the thing that they didn't tell my daughter when she was looking for a place to attend school. But she attended Clemson. She graduated from Clemson University. So that's one category of places that I go to. Another such category of places, presidential sites. How many of you were hanging out with us yesterday? Can I see your hands? How many of you were around at the campfire conversation last night? Okay, a great number of you. How many of you slept in the cabins last night? Okay, less hands are going up. Okay, that's good. We're making progress. So the presidential sites. So 12 of our presidents were slave owners. 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. 8 of whom owned slaves while they were in office. And for those of you who try to guess that or look up those 12 presidents, the one that probably will surprise you the most is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses Grant was an enslaver. Now, he came across that through marrying his wife, but the way the rules were back then, if the wife should bring wealth into the marriage, as soon as she says, I do, what happens? It reverts to the male. That's why a lot of times when you're doing research, you find that these men who brought nothing into the marriage, they say, I do. What are they going to do? They're going to do an inventory. So for you researchers, if you think in that manner, if you can find that information, that's a good resource of information. In inventory, I say inventory because back then, folks, our enslaved ancestors were treated as property, and they were labeled as such. I tell black folks often, if you're doing research, think about our ancestors the way the enslavers did, as property. And you can get further in your research faster. Now, I know it's hard for us, all this historical trauma involved in uncovering all this information. But it's helpful if you think about them in that manner, and it'll get you along in your research. So back to the presidential sites. So one site that I stayed at was Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. You know, all men are created equal. Well, Thomas Jefferson owned 600 people. And of course, there's the Sally Hemings story. So now, back to the presidential site in Campfire. All right, so now we're around the campfire, similar to what we were doing last night. We're around the campfire. We're having a conversation, the descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved at Monticello. There's an element of that group who wants to think that it was a consensual relationship. And then there are the rest of them. And it got so contentious, guys, I had to step in physically to separate them, to break it up. Because I did not want the slave dwelling project to go out like that. You know, I wanted to maintain the opportunity to have those type of dialogues, have people coming around these campfires to have these conversations about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. When I say slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation, guys, we leave no stone unturned. You know, we talk about white supremacy. We talk about white privilege. We talk about historical trauma. We talk about Confederate monuments. Should they stay or should they go? We talk about weddings on plantations. Should they happen or should they not? And more recently, because the conversation has gotten so in-depth and this history is now being politicized, you know, we talk about the death of George Floyd. We talk about 1776 commission versus 1619 in Nicole Hannah Jones and now anti-CRT. All that stuff is a part of the conversation. And anybody that was here last night can verify that's what we do. We don't hold back. We don't hold back. And if you look at the demographics of this audience right now, it was similar last night. So you're having these conversations with people who don't look like you, a lot of times don't agree with you. Their politics sometimes are not the same, but we're not afraid to have those conversations. So now, that was the situation at Monticello. Next week, guys, next weekend, I'm going to James K. Polk Historic Site. It's a state park in Pineville, North Carolina. Now, James K. Polk also had ties to the state of Tennessee. When James K. Polk became president, he took a contingency of enslaved people with him to the White House, fired the hired staff, and replaced them with the enslaved worker in the White House. So another place that I've spent the night, and I'm working on going there again in June. I got to meet a group from Wisconsin, a group from Marquette University High School in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a Jesuit high school. It is a Jesuit high school. I meet these groups, I meet this particular group at some place in these United States, and we spend the night at these spaces. Well, one such conversation with this group, we were at Bacon's Castle, you know, the place of Bacon's Rebellion, you know, when a lot of our racism got embedded, when we started teaming up with the have-nots, teaming up with each other and forming these unions and coalitions, the Bacon's Rebellion, if you want to, you know, do a little research on that. So we're at Bacon's Castle, and before the sleepover that day, we had gone on a tour of where Nat Turner staged his revolt, his successful revolt. Successful in the sense that they were going from place to place, going and killing white folks. Successful in that sense. So in the conversation, it went a little something like this. Well, Joe, if you were alive during that time, would you have gone with Nat Turner? My answer was yes. So the response to that from one of the instructors was, but Joe, he was killing women and children. And my response to that was, well, if you have cancer and the doctor goes into your body to take out that cancer, you want him to take out the whole cancer, not part of the cancer. And I said that to say this. It was chattel slavery, folks. Not only were you enslaved, but your children and your children's children would be enslaved, which meant in the world of the enslaver, not only are you an enslaver, but your children and your children's children will be an enslaver. So that was my response. So getting back to the presidential sites and the fact that I'm trying to have a stay, I'm arranging a stay with that same group to stay at the Hermitage. That's the home of Andrew Jackson. So we're trying to make it happen. That was my very first stay at a presidential site. But you know, when I go to that presidential site now, I want to know more about the story. Not just the fact that he was a president, not only that he's on the $20 bill. I want to know more about that. I want to know about Indian removal, which brings me to this case of New Orleans and all that Andrew Jackson did for New Orleans, and the fact that in New Orleans you see what the mayor of that period, Mitch Landrieu, did to remove Confederate monuments, and kind of started this thing snowballing about Confederate monuments coming down in a quicker pace. Well, he's commended for doing that by some, but I don't think he went far enough, because he left Andrew Jackson right there in that square, Jackson Square. Isn't he just as worthy of being removed for his actions in removing Indians? You know, the Trail of Tears and all that. So I said that to say this. A part of the conversation last night, we talked about monuments. Should they stay or should they go? Now, I cautioned the audience in this sense, that in removing monuments, it gets a little tricky sometimes. I had this term called slippery slope. And I said, you know, when I look up at the Mount Rushmore, I see two slave owners, Mount Rushmore, but I don't want them to go away. You know, I go to Washington, D.C., there's the Washington Monument, there's the Jefferson Memorial. Two slave owners, but I don't want those monuments to go away. And I kind of complemented it with this story. In Memphis, Tennessee, there's a situation where this sign interpreted Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest, for those who don't know, was a Confederate commander during the Civil War. And he did great things if you apply it to his knowledge of being a Confederate commander, a cavalryman. He was successful in that sense. But then after the Civil War, he was one of the members who started the KKK. So they had this interpretive sign. And on this sign, they were interpreting that across the street was the business of Nathan Bedford Forrest. But they didn't say anything about what the business was. That sign said nothing about that. And they changed it. They took the sign down and they put in there that that business was the buying and selling of people. That satisfies me, guys, because now it tells people what that business was. That's the whole story. They changed the narrative by inserting into that interpretive sign that Nathan Bedford Forrest, that business that he was being commemorated for, was the buying and selling of people. And then connecting dots. So I went to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, I stayed in the Beauregard Kai's house. Beauregard, P.G.T. Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He ordered the first shot of the Civil War onto Fort Sumter. So that alone was enough to get me interested in staying in that particular house. But it went further. The gentleman who built the house was an auctioneer, a buyer and selling of people. I thought that was much more interesting than the fact that P.G.T. Beauregard fired the first shot. I ordered the first shot being fired on Fort Sumter. So around the campfire, we're having a conversation, at the Beauregard Kai's house. And the conversation goes a little something like this. Well, it was free labor because the people weren't paid. The enslaved people were not paid. Well, one gentleman objected, white gentleman. He said, no, it was not free labor because the enslaver fed them, he housed them, he clothed them. Not that he was wrong. Everything he said was correct. But his timing was bad. And another time I had to get physically between him and the rest of the audience to let them know, no, I don't want this project to end like this. But back to presidential sites. And I saved this one for last. And I gotta wait until this plane fly by because this is a nice, juicy one. You need to all hear this. Am I still in the frame? Still got me? All right, got it. Good. All right, so Monticello. How many, raise your hand, how many of you been paying attention to what's happening at Monticello? Presidential site, the Monticello. I see a few hands. Okay, for those of you who are not aware of what's going on at Monticello, Monticello is the home of President James Madison, the father of our Constitution. I'm sorry, got the wrong one. Thank you. Yeah, y'all keep me honest. That's why I have handlers, guys. Hear that, Kathy? Where's Kathy? Raise your hand. Thank you. Montpelier. Yeah, the home of James Madison, the father of our Constitution. We the people. We shed a red, we the people, comma, in this room. Because if you were not in that room, it meant nothing to you. Because it had to be amended to include the people who were not in that room. You know, if you're not a white man and a property owner, it meant nothing to you. Just simple as that. So now, last year sometime, they made a mutual agreement. The board made a mutual agreement that they were going to add descendants of the enslaved to their board to govern the place. Things were going along well. But now, about 3 weeks ago, they reneged on that commitment. And for those of you who are not familiar with what's going on at Montpelier, just Google it. It's all over the place. It's playing itself out in public now. And folks, if you want an example of what not to do, please do your research on that, because it's important for what we are attempting to do here. And I know that we can be successful here. But study what went on at Montpelier, and let's not make those mistakes. Because the potential that we have here to interpret this space and interpret the enslaved people who were here is a great opportunity that we have. As I look over this audience and I see the diversity here, that's a beautiful thing. You know, you guys don't have the angle that I have and looking at this from the angle that I'm looking at. Okay, I'm going to do what I did yesterday. Black folks in the audience. If you're visiting this place for the first time, all this weekend included, count it all. If you're visiting this place for the first time this weekend, please raise your hand. Yeah, see? Look at that. See the potential here? There's great potential here, guys. This place has been here all your lives. Well, I don't know how long all of you've lived here, but this place certainly has been here all of your lives. And why is it that the slave cabin back there is the only extant slave dwelling, or the only slave dwelling that still exists here in this capital city? Why is that? Was that intentional? I say yes. That's why I do what I do. Because there was this attempt to get rid of these buildings with the intent of trying to erase that element of history. That's why it's very important now that we, as a group, we take on these challenges that we have to how our kids are being educated. You know, this attempt to keep this element of history from our youth, we need to be on top of that. So again, you know, presidential sites. This thing at Montpelier is playing itself out in the public, and if you haven't taken a side yet, I hope you will. Slave Dwelling Project has taken a side. Joe McGill has taken a side. We support the descendants of the enslaved. We support those staff members who have been fired because they supported the descendants of the enslaved. We got to let these sites know that they cannot fall victim to this attempt to not teach this element of our history. So another thing that we do, this weekend I'm traveling alone. They thank you for Rowena for inviting me here, but there's more. There could be more. I hope that in the future I'm going to get another invitation, and I'm hoping that we tap into the other resources that the Slave Dwelling Project has to offer. One such resource is our living historians. What I have found out is that, you know, I'm one person. You know, I can go to these places and I can sleep in these places, but there's some things I cannot do. I'm not a storyteller. I cannot demonstrate how bricks are made. I cannot demonstrate how the cooking was done back then. I could not demonstrate the blacksmithing that was done during that period. But I've got others who travel with me that can do that. So sometimes when I travel to these places, I have a contingency of living historians that travel with me. When I go to Polk, James K. Polk's site yesterday, I'm taking the brickmaker, I'm taking the blacksmith, I'm taking the storytellers, I'm taking the cooks, and we're going to be demonstrating at that site. Now, one mistake that some of these sites make is that they have a tendency to want to do these living history events, but the people doing these demonstrations are white. That's not how it was done historically. So why are you presenting this false narrative and letting folks witness these demonstrations and not hiring the black folks to do it? So we took that to heart. We're kind of like a colonial Williamsburg on wheels. You know, we'll take the program to you if you want it. Of course, there's a cost, but if you want it, we can take the program to you. We have that capability. So that's a part of our evolution. Now, another thing that I discovered, folks, is this. When I started 12 years ago, I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South. And I wasn't wrong for that, because again, that's how I was educated. A plantation in the South, slaves were happy, the enslavers were benevolent. Again, my education. Well, what I was missing was urban slavery and northern slavery. How many of you in the crowd are from a northern state? Okay, all right. I see a few hands. Which state are you from, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you raise your hand?
I don't know. It was neutral. Missouri was neutral.
Missouri?
Missouri was kind of weird.
Missouri? You said Missouri is kind of weird?
Yeah, it's kind of neutral.
Oh, well, I agree.
It still is.
Yeah, Missouri. You know, you heard the term brother against brother? Yeah, a lot of that went on in Missouri, because Missouri was, it didn't commit one way or the other, but, you know, Missouri sent more men to serve for the Confederacy than served for the Union. And that term brother against brother really played itself out in Missouri. You raise your hand back there. What state are you from? Illinois? Okay, I'm working on Illinois. Illinois, there was a place in southern Illinois where people would escape into the free state of Illinois. This one gentleman would capture them, enslave them in the salt mines, and he also had a breeding business. Where are you from? New Jersey. New Jersey? Okay, New Jersey. There's a place in New Jersey called Morven. It's in Princeton. Used to be your governor's mansion. That's where I spent the night. New Jersey abolished slavery in 1804, but at the beginning of the Civil War, people were still enslaved in New Jersey. More? Ohio? Still working on Ohio. Ohio was one of those states that before you entered the Union, you had to deal with that slavery thing. And I think right around 1804, of course, New Jersey said there will be no slavery in the state of Ohio. But they also had this thing that says, if you want to, we would not enslave you, but you need to be free somewhere else. Just, in other words, keep it moving. Let's see, any more? New York. Yeah. I like that T-shirt you're wearing. All right. Stand up. Let's both see that T-shirt. You guys see that T-shirt? Yeah, that's nice. I think there's a second one like that. Just stand up. Yeah, you guys see that T-shirt? Yeah. You guys we got to take a picture together. All right. So New York. New York. Last time I was in New York the other about a month ago. When COVID hit, we had to shut things down. I had to cancel my trip to New York City. And I had to cancel my very first trip to New York City. Because up until that point, I had never been to New York City. But about a month ago, I got to go to New York City, to the place that I canceled, which was the Bronx. It was, I stayed at the Van Cortlandt Manor House, Museum. New York abolished slavery in 1799. The last person freed in New York was 1827. In 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. Any other Northerners?
Washington.
As in Washington State? Nothing for you yet. I'm working on it. But the Lewis and Clark expedition, it went through Washington State, so there's something. York was enslaved, so that might be my in. Okay, so get back to the point here. So we do the living history, and that's a great thing. But back to the fact that 12 years ago when I started the Slave Dwelling Project, I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South, and I found out otherwise, that all the slavery went on in these northern states. And I gave you examples of some of the places that I've gone to prove that slavery did exist in those northern states. And even when those northern states, abolished slavery legislatively, they were still complicit, because they still own the insurance companies, the banks. In fact, New York almost seceded when South Carolina seceded, because they were so financially invested in that institution of slavery. They still own the ships bringing them in, and they own the factories adding value to the cotton that was being picked. So what do we have going on in the future? The Stono Rebellion, the Atlantic World. That's the name of our upcoming conference. Our upcoming conference will be September 8th through the 10th. September 8th through the 10th of this year. Now, come May 1st, we're going to be taking, or up to May 1st, we're going to be taking proposals to present. Stono Rebellion and the Atlantic World. So it's going to center around rebellion, resistance, and resilience. Rebellion, resistance, and resilience. Rowena, you guys qualify. What you guys are doing here is quite rebellious, because you guys have proclaimed that this building, this slave dwelling, is the only one left in this capital city. You guys have taken possession of that. You own that now. People are going to challenge that, in the sense that they're going to try to find another one to prove you wrong, which is good. I hope they do that. But they're going to come at you from another angle also. They're going to come at you from an angle, the fact that you made a vow in your board, you got the support of your board, that you guys are going to be telling the whole story. There are a lot of people unaware that slavery even existed in this state. There are a lot of people unaware that for this city to be named after the person who was named for, he was involved in slavery. you're presenting to the public the fact that, yeah, we can celebrate in all this greatness, but in obtaining all this greatness, we committed some atrocities. And we're acknowledging that these atrocities were committed. So what you guys are doing, I think you should submit a proposal to let the world know that you're doing it. And not only are you doing it, you're getting input from all these people here that are willing to be a part of this process. Because what I hope is that I'm going to come back here. Not only am I going to come back here, but I want to know that these folks are still involved. I hope they don't get disenchanted in the process, because this term that we use, we call it white savior. And it came up yesterday in the conversation, the pushback that you're getting from people who look like me, because we are so accustomed, as it was explained, to not having a say, and we're also accustomed to folks the white folks bringing us the plan and said, this is what it's going to be. Not consulting us along the way, not making us a part of the process, just saying, well, we're going to do it, and this is the way we're going to do it. We don't need your input. But what I'm witnessing so far, what I'm seeing is that that's not the way it's happening here. You're getting the input from the people that you need to get the input from, and that's a great thing. So please keep doing that. So September 8th through September 10th, we will have the conference in Charleston, South Carolina. For those of you who have visited Charleston, South Carolina, add to that, build on that. For those of you who have never visited South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, make it your first time and be a part of that. There's also going to be a digital component to it, because we got to be realistic. I think we're in a better place now. We know more about COVID than we did a year ago, 2 years ago. And I see the confidence here. I got to get on a plane in a few hours. When I came out here, wearing a mask was optional. Although I think some folks should go back behind a mask, but it's not for health reasons, not the reasons. So I heard somebody got that joke. All right, so when I come back, I want to see this group to be just as diverse as I'm seeing it right now, and because we're embarking on a thing here together. I say together because I make commitments to organizations like this, because 12 years ago I didn't think that I'd still be doing this. Again, I wanted to be in this thing 1 year and done in the state of South Carolina, but not 12 years later and 25 states later in the District of Columbia, I'm still at it. And I don't know how much longer I'm going to be at this thing. I don't know how many more times I could lay down on a hard floor and get back up. I don't know that. We're going through some strategic planning right now, the organization Slave Dwelling Project. We are a nonprofit organization. We're going through that phase of strategic planning to help figure some of that out. But I know the fight is not over. I know that your guys, the hard work has just begun. But just know that I'm with you. I want to continue to be with you. You certainly have my support, so the support of my board. We got the opportunity to show Montpelier how it should be done. And I know that we're going to be successful at it. And they're going to be looking at us for instructions on how this thing should work. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think I need to wrap it up and yield to my host to see where we go from here. Do we have an opportunity for questions and answers? I see she's coming up here to give me instructions, so here she is. So where do we go from here?
I can bring it back to you.
You can give instructions.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I think we do have some time to take a few questions if anybody has any. So I think the best thing to do is he has to stay here because of the camera. But I can move around and hand the microphone off so people can hear, and then I'll bring it back to him, so it'll be a little awkward. Do know that when we do finish up here, the film is still playing inside. If you have not watched it, it's incredibly powerful. I commend it to you. Also, I just want to say, before we go to questions, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being a part of this with us. Thank you to the entire staff of the Neill-Cochran House Museum, who have done just an absolutely incredible job. Thanks to Blake and Nick, who have been our AV gurus, and I say this to Blake all the time, he lowers my blood pressure. Knowing that he's going to be here, it'll all be fine. And also to McGill for playing. I don't know if he's still here today, but sharing his talents with us today. And I would be certainly remiss if I didn't thank the Adisa team, led by Sharonda Robinson and Millie, who I don't know where y'all are right now, but those two also lower my blood pressure, and they're incredible human beings and have done an incredible job helping us to get the word out about this. So that's all from me, and I'm gonna, if anybody have any questions, and I'll kind of, yeah.
Can I move with the mic?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this offering today. I wanted to know what your experience was last night staying here. What did you feel before, during, and then after the experience?
Hey, and while I'm walking, one other thing I forgot to say was, if you haven't left your email with us today and would like to, please do. Everybody who did leave their email with us is going to be hearing from us, and we mean it when we say that we want your input. So when we reach out, if you have something to share, please do.
So what did I feel last night? It's kind of like, what do I feel ever at these places? I think it maybe is asked more appropriately as, what did I want to feel? And really, it's nothing. And I say that sincerely, because to feel is to get into the minds and bodies of our enslaved ancestors, a place I really don't want to be. And here's why. You know, I have to communicate with the stewards of these places. And to get into the minds and bodies of our enslaved ancestors is getting into a place where a lot of times there's a lot of pain. A lot of times there's a lot of anger and desire to be free. And if those things can be communed or communicated, those are the things that I don't want to hear. Those are the things that I don't want to experience. Knowing that, you know, the ancestors, I'm sure they would have good intentions toward me, because I do this to honor them. But in order to continue to do this to honor them, I gotta be able to move on to the next site and pay attention to the physicalness of what I do and concentrate on the physical, tangible things that I can encounter at these sites. So I try to keep my mind right there. Although I was in that space upstairs all by myself, there was somebody in the bottom level, there was other people, other places on the site. So that question might be more appropriate for them, because they come for various reasons. Some come trying to commune with the ancestors. It's not my intention. So I just, I'm just aware of what's going on around me. You know, shortly after my head hit that pillow, I'm doing this social media thing on my phone, and you know, I'm communicating to an audience, but that's about the extent of of what I do and what I try to feel.
And somebody much smarter than me came up with the idea that it'd be better for y'all to come up here. And then you can ask your question and head back.
Mr. McGill, thank you for being here. This is an amazing presentation. I had a question about the places you visited. We had the opportunity to see the slave quarters at Mount Vernon. Have you slept there? Can you tell us about it?
Mount Vernon. Yeah, it took me a while to get into Mount Vernon. That was a tough nut to crack, but I eventually got there 5 years after the initial request. Of course, Mount Vernon, you have the slave dwellings that were used more like a dormitory. That's where I did not sleep. But a little further away from the main house, there's a farm. There's an octagonal barn, and near that octagonal barn is a recreated slave dwelling, and that's where I slept. Very small space. We crammed about 12 people into that very small space, some upstairs, some downstairs. We had a conversation before the fact, mainly concerning, George Washington. But the sleepover itself was preceded by that conversation, and a lot of it was about George Washington and his wife, and the fact that there was that opportunity to free some of his enslaved people, and that in his will there was this provision to do that, and the fact that his wife owned some of those enslaved people who he had no power to free. But those are the things that that happened at Mount Vernon. Again, once we got the permission to do that. So yeah, that was it.
Mr. McGill, what do you plan on going forward? Do you have a plan on going to a plantation each state, or how do you have a plan on that, or go as it comes up? Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I wanna go to a place in each state. Now, in each state, I probably won't find a slave dwelling, but I gotta I gotta figure out how I define where these enslaved people lived or stayed. Take California, for instance, who entered the Union in 1858 as a free state. But if you think about California in the sense that there were the 49ers, not the football team, but those gold seekers. Some of those men were slave owners, and they took enslaved people with them. So that's the angle that I have to take. When I stayed in Wisconsin, a free state, I stayed in Fort Dodge, Wisconsin, because the first territorial governor in Wisconsin was a slave owner. I also stayed at Prairie du Chien at Fort Crawford, because Jefferson Davis was stationed there. Jefferson Davis and other Southern men like him were paid money to hire someone to take care of their personal needs. Well, they didn't hire anyone, they took enslaved people with them. So that's why I stayed at Prairie du Chien. In Minnesota, another free state, I stayed at Fort Snelling, because that's where Dred Scott was enslaved by an Army medic. And because he was enslaved by an Army medic in Minnesota, he took his case to the Supreme Court, and he lost. The Supreme Court ruled in 1857 that he nor his wife had any rights that any white people had to honor. So in finding these places and in sleeping in these places, you gotta think differently. I described the way I'm trying to get into Illinois. Somebody told me that they live in Ohio, and so far I haven't not stayed in a place in Ohio. Well, in Cincinnati, there's a museum called the Freedom Center. Well, they got a slave dwelling in there. I'd go into that museum and I'd sleep in there. So, I got to get creative when I apply this to all the states in this union. You know, and there are people out there that have leads. You know, I'll be going to Rhode Island this year. I'll be going to a private residence. It'll be the second time going to Rhode Island, but I want to highlight the fact that I'll be going to a private residence. Somebody there who, you know, acquired the property just recently, within the last 2 years, and they saw a presentation of mine. You know, we went into this COVID mode, and I was doing more broadcasting from my home office. You know, they were part of one of those broadcasts, and because they became aware of the slave dwelling project through that broadcast, they invited me to their private residence, and I'll be going there to you know, to spend the night. So I guess I say that to say this. You know, you have to be ambassadors. If you know of places out there that qualify, that fits the mold, then let's make it happen. You know, there are places, other places here in Texas that you know, that fits the category of where I should go. I've only stayed at 4 places in Texas. I stayed at Egypt Plantation, Seward Plantation in Brenham, Texas, correct? I stayed at the Dallas Heritage Village. I'll be going there again next month, and this is the 4th. You know, there are more places in the state of Texas that qualify, you know, where I need to go. You know, I'm going to assume that the same may apply in some of those larger cities that apply here. This is the only one. But yesterday during the presentation, there was somebody here from San Antonio that at least hinted at trying to get me there. Yeah, I want to remember the Alamo, but I want to remember it for the fact that you know, that fight was about slavery. You know, that Davy Crockett stuff is nice, but you know, there's more to the story than that. We want to bring, you know, to the table the elements of why the Alamo really was. So there's that.
Lydia, can you come around? You have a question? Go for it.
So you mentioned Montpelier. You mentioned the Montpelier situation. Is there a particular political action that people can take relative to that?
Political action, Montpelier? I don't know if there's a political action that one could take, but I think the fact that they renege is political, in the sense that, you know, June of last year, everything was great. And then there was an election, a governor who was elected. Governor Youngkin, I think is his name. You know, in the Virginia governor's mansion, I stayed there last year. And I stayed in a place similar to where I stayed last night. And the place that I stayed had in the bottom a kitchen, and they outfitted it as it would have been outfitted during the time of slavery, and people had access to that space. They could go and learn and study that place. Well, since the election, access to that place has been denied, and the place that I spent the night, that historic space that I spent the night, is now becoming an exercise room. So I think that was political. So as far as a political action to rectify what's taking place now at Monticello, I guess an election would help. You know, in the next 4 years, that would help. But that does nothing immediately for the fact that now they're reneging on the fact that, you know, they've been telling the story the way it should have been told for all this time. Now they're taking all that back. Not only are they taking all that back, they fired the staff members, high-level staff members who were in support of telling the story in the manner that it was being told, and that's the right way. So I guess in that sense there's a political action that could be taken, but that's going to involve an election, you know, 4 years from now. So the instructions is, if you got a question, you have to come up here, because I got to sit here. And it appears that there's no more folks coming in this direction. So then, I want to thank you all for being a part of this and taking the time to be a part of the process. And I want you to stay engaged so that Rowena and her staff and her crew and her board will have the support that they need to know that this is what you guys want. And you guys have networks. Tell them what you saw here this weekend. Tell them what's being done here at this location. Especially tell them about the diversity of what you're seeing here. Come up front if you need to and take a picture, take evidence of what's being done here. So again, thank you, Rowena, for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, everybody. And again, like 3 cheers to this guy who's on the road every single weekend right now. And he's such an advocate. And I posted something personally on Facebook earlier today, a photo of him speaking with all of you in the crowd. And I said he was talking about the Slave Dwelling Project, of which we now officially are a part, which is great. Thanks so much.